Love 333. And I just want to welcome you again to our book talk that's been ongoing. This is day 15, and we are reading out of the book White Like Me by Tim Wise, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son. That's where we have been reading, and that's where our conversation has been coming from. Tim Wise has been a a person that has been a long-time advocate for anti-racism. He travels across the country. Although Tim Wise and I do not share the same views spiritually, we do share the same views when it comes to things like white supremacy, racism, white privilege, and what those terms mean. So that's why we have been reading out of his book. He's actually been talking about his own viewpoints, and he's been talking about how those things have affected his life, how he has lived a life of privilege, and what that actually means and what that actually looks like. And so Tim Wise has been walking us in this particular book, which is part research and part memoir. He's been walking us through his own life, starting with his early years in elementary school, then moving to middle school, high school, and now he's walking us through his college years. And so one of the things that he is talking about here today is this notion of being an advocate for people of color and finding out that even in your advocacy for people of color, there's ways and there's things that you can miss even in your desire to help. So that is where we are in the reading. Please excuse my voice a little bit here. I've just got some ice and water and just trying to clear my throat just a little bit. All right, so we can be clear as we're reading here. So let us begin. With a new batch of activist students ready and fired up about the divestment struggle of South Africa, those of us who had been leading the charge for 2 years tried once again to jumpstart the movement. In the fall of 1989, our alliance, now renamed Tulane Students Against Apartheid because of the university's threat to sue us if we continue to call ourselves the Tulane Alliance, thereby implying supposedly official university endorsement, once again took over a board meeting. Facing several hundred demonstrators and with the divestment petition having grown to include the names of over 3,500 students, staff, and faculty, the trustees finally agreed to negotiations with the protesters. At our first meeting to discuss divestment with the board, it became obvious that the university's wealthy white policymakers had no intention of taking the issue seriously. First, we noticed that the university already had an ethical investment policy in place, passed in 1985, which prohibited it from investing in companies that contributed to human rights violations. It seemed apparent that continued investment in the 25 corporations in South Africa was a violation of the board's own policy. Upon being issued this challenge, one of the board members, either Sybil Favreau or Virginia Roddy, rich white women, all look alike to me, responded, "Well, how do we know if these companies are actually contributing to human rights violations?" Putting aside the argument that any corporate investment in South Africa would automatically bolster apartheid and thus contribute to human rights abuses, I posed a hypothetical. Imagine, I asked, that we were invested in Shell Oil, which, given the powerful presence of the petroleum industry in and around New Orleans, seemed reasonable, though we couldn't be certain given the school's refusal to open the portfolio. Since Shell recently called in South African security forces to shoot rubber bullets at striking workers, would that, in your mind, constitute a human rights violation sufficient to trigger the policy with regard to ethical investment? Well, she began before clarifying beyond any doubt that money and ethics bear no necessary relationship to one another. I guess it would depend on why they were striking. I am rarely at a loss for words, but this was to be such a time. Suffice it to say that the rest of the meeting didn't go much better. Fast forward to winter break. I was home for the holidays when I stumbled upon a book detailing the connections between university investments and political and economic repression in South Africa and Central America. In the book's index, the author provided a summary of several companies involved in human rights abuses and the names of some of the schools that held stock in those companies, along with the number of shares held at the time of the book's writing. Tulane was listed several times and was invested in about a dozen companies that had contributed everything from oil refining technology to the South Africans, to military helicopters, to the dictatorships in Guatemala and El Salvador. It was the material that we had been looking for. Upon returning to campus in January, we called a press conference to release the list of Tulane's dirty dozen corporations and to demand that the school follow its own policy with regard to ethical investment by divesting itself of stock in those firms and any others about which we were unaware. The board, in response, announced they were breaking off negotiations with the anti-apartheid group because the release of the information indicated we were acting in bad faith. But this coming from people who needed to know why workers were on strike before they could say definitely that shooting them might be objectionable. In the third week of March, we again built shanties, but this time on the lawn in front of the administration building, Gibson Hall, facing the streetcar line on St. Charles Avenue. By bringing the protest to the exterior of the campus, in front of its most visible structure, we hope to heighten the public's awareness of the school's practices and to force divestment, or at least the opening of the portfolio to full scrutiny. A week into the protest, when Jesse Jackson came to campus for an unrelated speech and called for the university to heed the protesters' demands, we figured we were on our way to victory. That evening, I announced that several of the group's members, including myself, would begin a hunger strike the following Monday if our key demands, short of divestment itself, were not met by that time. Needless to say, they wouldn't be, and so the hunger strike started on schedule. On the fourth day of the strike, we received word that the university had agreed to 5 of the 10 demands, including those we had insisted upon in order for the action to end and for negotiations to resume. These included the opening of the portfolio and a commitment to bring in ethical investment experts to help plan future directions for the management of the school's general fund. Though we celebrated this outcome as a victory for the movement, deep down, everyone knew there was something unsatisfying about it. Apartheid was thankfully in its waning days, as signaled by the release of Nelson Mandela in February. As a result, the board had recognized that before it would really have to make any changes, the situation in Africa would probably change, and with it, there would be no more need to clean out its portfolio. Tulane was going to hold out longer than the racists in Pretoria, which was saying a lot. But what the divestment effort taught me about the moral compasses of the Tulane Board of Administrators would prove to be among the more unimportant lessons of the campaign. Far more intriguing would be the lesson I would learn about myself and even the best intended activist efforts. Specifically, the lesson I would learn about how even in our resistance to racist structures, we can reinforce racism and collaborate with the very forces we claim to be opposing. Though I saw none of this for most of my time at Tulane, the closest I ever came to having one of those light bulb moments that people always ask about was during that period on the second night of the hunger strike. That evening, with only a month or so left in my academic career, we had a public debate on campus against representatives of the New Orleans Libertarian Party. The Libertarians would argue that investment in South Africa was a good thing for blacks because it provided them with jobs, however unequal those jobs may be, and that if companies pulled out, Black South Africans would suffer most. It was an argument with which we had been contending from the outset and which all of us knew how to pick apart. By the time the debate was over, virtually everyone in the crowd of 300 or so was on our side. Confident that we had made our point, Eldon Chandler and I leaned back during the question and answer period, expecting to further drive home the moral imperative of divestment to the audience. Most of the questions were pretty routine and were directed at our opponents rather than us. And then it happened. The moderator for the evening called on a young woman in the dead center of the small but packed auditorium who would get the last question of the night. Because she was Black, I assumed that she would be on the side of divestment. She was, of course, but she hadn't come that evening to praise the movement. After identifying herself as a first-year student at Xavier University, the nation's only historically Black Catholic college, located about 2 miles away, and prefacing her question by noting that as a New Orleans, she was embarrassed that Tulane was still invested in these companies, she got to what was on her mind. In the process, she dropped the bomb that would, more than anything, alter the way I understood my own relationship to privilege. Tim, she asked, how long have you lived in New Orleans? 4 years, I replied. Okay, then tell me in that 4 years, what one thing have you done to address apartheid in this city? Since after all, you benefit from that apartheid. She crossed her arms in front of her and stood and waited. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. The seconds crept by, each one pounding like a drill into my skull. By now the air had been sucked out of the room, she having asked the one question for which I had been unprepared. The only one I had never anticipated, and the only one at the end of the day that really mattered. 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi. It seemed like hours since she had asked her question, and I briefly considered the possibility that we had been sitting there overnight waiting for my answer. I'm sure no more than a few seconds had passed, but in those seconds, enough truth was revealed to last a lifetime. I began to have the sensation that I was in my car speeding away from town and suddenly saw the blue lights flashing in my rearview mirror. The lights that say, gotcha. But unlike the last time I got a ticket, I wasn't going to have 30 seconds to come up with some story that could get me out of whatever trouble I was in. This time the officer was at my window, badge out, gun drawn, and it was now or never that I would offer an answer, and so I did. Well, I said, clearing my throat before the silent audience, I mean, we all pick our battles. Oh, crap. No, he didn't. Yes, I had. And as soon as the words tumbled from my lips, I knew something significant had happened. More to the point, so did just about everyone else. The young lady uncrossed her arms and smiled a knowing smile, her expression betraying a mix of satisfaction and disgust at how easy it had been to expose me. A buzzing started behind my ears, coupled with a strange warmth that made me fear my head might explode like that guy on the stage in the sci-fi flick Scanners. I started having flashbacks to all those dreams. I'm sure you've had them too, where you suddenly find yourself naked in front of your third grade class or at prom or something. An earthquake could have hit at that moment thinking back to it. I probably wish that one would have, and it had done so. I likely wouldn't have noticed it. I don't remember another thing from that night, so shaken was I by her question and my answer, not because I had been in possession of a better answer that I had simply forgotten to offer, but because I had had no answer at all. That had been it. I had told the truth and now had to confront what such disturbing honesty suggested. Over the next few days, the administration would partially cave to our demands, the shanties would come down, the hunger strike would end. But even after I began to replenish my body with the nourishment I had been denying it, the pit in my stomach remained because it had nothing to do with food. I tried to put the whole thing behind me, but couldn't. I kept coming back to the fact that I had been doing all this work against racism half a world away, but frankly had done nothing to speak of in opposition to the racism in the town where I had been living. I had done nothing in answer to the de facto apartheid conditions that existed in New Orleans. Conditions that, as the young woman that night had pointed out, had benefited me as a white man who could count on my privilege to insulate me from their impact. I began to remember all the things I had ignored or downplayed as I focused on the racial oppression that was occurring on another continent. Harry Lee in racial profiling in Jefferson Parish, or Tulane's lack of recruiting in New Orleans schools being two of the most obvious. And there was one more, even worse, which had just transpired under our noses and about which we had said and done nothing. 3 days after our shanty siege had begun, New Orleans police killed a black man named Adolph Archie, suspected of killing a white police officer. When police caught him, beat him, and took him to the hospital, a lynch mob of additional officers had gathered after broadcasting open death threats over their police scanners. Instead of entering the hospital with Archie, they drove him to a precinct station and over several hours beat him so badly that every bone in his face would be broken. He would die at the hospital after police got tired of brutalizing him. And although his death would be ruled a homicide by police intervention, no officers involved in his killing would ever be punished. As Adolph Archie was being pulverized by New Orleans cops, my comrades and I had been sleeping the sleep of the just, or at least the self-righteous, uptown in shacks of our own construction, protected by Tulane police around the clock for the entire 2-week period of the protest. We had never even discussed the killing of Archie, never connected the all too obvious dots, never supposed that perhaps there might be something similar about the way police operated in New Orleans and the way they operated in Soweto. Remember, we all pick our battles. I had been completely oblivious to the way in which my own privilege and the privilege of whites generally had obscured our understanding of such issues as accountability, the need to link up struggles like the connection between racism in New Orleans and that of South Africa, and the need to always have leadership of color in any anti-racist struggle. It's the same lessons still not learned by white activists in most cases, whether in the anti-sweatshop movement, the Justice for Darfur movement, the anti-war movement. Too often the same mistakes are made, mostly white radicals who have the luxury of picking and choosing issues on which to get active, unlike people of color who also care about different issues but have to deal with racism as a manner of survival. Refuse to connect the dots between the oppression taking place in another country and the oppression going on down the block. Although we have to forgive ourselves for the mistakes we make, we must first acknowledge them. We must first face up to the fact that in our resistance, we too often reinforce the hierarchical arrangements we strive to oppose. Only by being called out as I was can we learn this in most cases. Only by being exposed to our flaws, forced to deal with them and learn from them, can we move forward and strengthen our resistance in the future. If there is one thing I've learned, it's that we who are white, and specifically white anti-racists, will screw up more times than we care to count, more times than we expected, and just about as often as people of color already figured we would. Saying this does not diminish us, and it doesn't mean that we have no important role to play in the destruction of white supremacy. It just means that privilege sometimes costs us the clarity of vision needed to see what we're doing and how even in our resistance, we sometimes play the collaborator. This is our reading for today. Tim Wise brought up a really, really excellent point. And even today, even in 2016, I still see this as being true, that I've run across people, especially my white friends and counterparts, who really want to play a part in dismantling racism, But oftentimes, as he said, when you are working at your goal, but you're not willing to collaborate with, or when you're not willing to allow people of color to lead these struggles, you often see out of one perspective or one direction or one lens. And that is kind of what he realized when the black girl approached him and said, you know, hey, I know you're trying to focus on this problem that's halfway around the world, but what are you doing in your own backyard to dismantle racism? Sometimes it's just comfortable to work on a problem that's halfway around the world rather than deal with it right where you are. I think about what's happening, what has happened with natural disasters. It's kind of the same thing. If a natural disaster happens over in Haiti, over in, you know, one of our Asian countries, people are so quick to say, hey, I want to join a missions team and I want to go halfway around the world to help out this natural disaster. But you have natural disasters right here in the United States. You have, you know, environmental things that are going on right in your own neighborhood that you could be focused on helping or solving. So it's kind of that same idea that, as Tim Wise is saying, he was so focused on what was happening in South Africa with apartheid, that he was missing the apartheid that was happening right in his own city. And it forced him to really be honest with himself and to say, are you really, you know, quote unquote, as they say, are you really about that life? Or are you just trying to make a statement or trying to make a point as a college student? Are you just trying to show that you're involved in some kind of activism as opposed to being committed to this kind of particular activism no matter where you are, whether you're doing it in another country or whether you're doing it locally? So that was a very, very good point. Tomorrow, we look to pick up, will be on day 16, and he is going to continue talking about his life after college and where his activism goes from there. For those of you who are just joining us, we are reading White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son by Tim Wise. I encourage you to pick up the book, read along with us. We're on page 125, so we're about halfway through this book, and we're going on from this book to Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. This has been our book talk for today. I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. Take care, and God bless. And again, this has been our book talk for today. I hope that you have a great and wonderful day. Take care, and God bless.